tough when you're in PC. Life's rough when you depend on me to give you weapons and armor information for your journey, and still you still push it and try to hurt me. Life's tough when you're in PC. Life's rough.
So, we have a couple of little announcements first, before we actually get into everything. And if you're a person who doesn't want to listen to announcements, then I've already left the timestamp ahead. You can go ahead and jump on to the actual video at large. So, here are the announcements. First off, I will be at C2E2 this Friday, March 23rd. So, if you happen to be there in Chicago for C2E2, maybe we might run into each other. We'll see. The other one is that on Project Derailed we have a new podcast coming up, and this one is going to be taking basically a D&D game and putting it into the podcast world, and what we're going to be doing is creating a Spelljammer game. So please, by all means, it's myself, Saker, who does my intro music with the band 2D6, as well as content creator for Project Derailed and Mary Sue, as well as one of the writers on Aberrant, Fiona Kelly, and also Nick Roseva, who has been in charge of Project Derailed's Critical Role recaps and is the guy who heads the whole thing. So, please, if you're a really big fan of podcasts, and if you're, just a huge fan of D&D and Spelljammer in particular, I suggest you check it out. And last but not least, as always, please become my patron on Patreon so that I can keep doing what I love to do, one of my favorite hobbies. And thank you all so much for those who already do for their support. With that being said, on to the video. Weird that today's topic is strangely nostalgic for me for a game that is new, and it's really weird now that I'm kind of like sitting here talking about it with you, because the open source gaming licenses, it was a huge thing whenever it came out for 3.5. So whenever it came out for 3.5, it was really like this Russian roulette of gaming. Whenever you would pick up a game that had the open source gaming license tag in the front, and you really didn't know what you were going to get. You could have gotten something like Thieves World or Midnight, but at the same time, you could have gotten what most of them were, which was a lot of crap that was just kind of ham-fisted the 3.5 mechanics right into their game. So, this was really nostalgic for me because this is the first 5th edition open source gaming license game that I've seen so far, and it comes to us from an couple of old college friends of mine, and that game that we're talking about today is Spaceships Starwyrms. The topic of today's game is a science fiction space epic, in the similar vein to shows like Firefly or video games like Mass Effect. It has this huge, expansive universe of different races, monsters, and just general ways of life that really kind of pulls you in and engrosses you in what they have to offer. Playing with the moniker of Dungeons & Dragons, in this case Spaceships Starwyrms, S&S, this comes to us from the minds of Benjamin Quiggins and Audrey Stoles, who seems to be tackling a video that I did a long time ago about why there isn't this huge science fiction equivalent to Dungeons & Dragons. S&S, like others that use the open source license, does run into an unfortunate handicap when it comes to assessing games such as this. Any game that uses the open source license does defer its dice mechanics to using Wizards of the Coast. As such, it does take a hit in terms of not creating its own dice mechanics. Is this bad? Does this actually hurt the game? Are all open source games just instantly get like the B+ because they did this? Hell no, definitely not. You see, I consider this much more of like a strategy for developers, that you have the open source out there, and if you want to just forego creating your own unique dice system and like strategically coming up with all these different mechanics, how they work and whatnot, you can forego all that and go with the open source gaming license and make sure that your story, your mechanics, and all these other things that you change mesh really well with the 5th edition game mechanics. It's a really good strategy, but it does run the risk for a game to do this because you take away a major aspect that can be criticized or praised. So basically what I'm saying is that if you're using open source, you can still have an A+ fantastic game that will stand the test of time. Just look at Thieves World for an example of that in action. But what I will say is this, is that if you are using open source gaming license, your game pretty well has to be perfect in just about every other facet. Even rolling back to the 3.5 license, games like Thieves World and Midnight were few and far between, with the large dregs of games that use the open source, and then poorly used the mechanics, or their mythos just didn't really have any substance to it, or was not up to par. So SNS is already in this sort of uphill battle. It's using open source, so everything else, like mythos and how it actually meshes with the 5th edition mechanics, have to be spot on. You also have the fact that there is a space sort of epic that has been created from Wizards of the Coast, and that is Spelljammer. So already you're kind of in this uphill battle, and it's really interesting to see how is SNS going to stack up to all of this. And the answer is pretty goddamn well. For starters, the game does a great job at blending its elements with that of 5th edition. It changes what it needs to change and adds what it needs to add, while keeping the majority of the 5th edition elements intact. If you want to look at this in action, I would say look at the class system. Immediately you can see they use several archetypes, classes from D&D, straight up fighter, rogue, bard, and they put them into this futuristic setting, changing a little bit of proficiencies to match with the actual story that's being told. And then you have things like psionics that are completely different that you just won't find in a D&D game. And then you have vanguards and adepts, which are basically reimagined versions of barbarians and monks. And they alter what they need to alter while still keeping sort of the idea of them intact. And it really is a very unique way of looking at these different classes, in a way that also mixes science fiction and fantasy in a way that I haven't really seen since Shadowrun. Combat as well gets a change. In my opinion, almost for the better. It incorporates elements into the game such as suppressing fire and taking cover in a way that I think that would actually help improve 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons as it stands. It also incorporates hacking abilities in and out of combat, which also still gives it that Shadowrun feel that I talked about just a moment ago. Then, of course, you have space battles and spaceships, one of the best parts of space science fiction. And essentially, their mechanics for that kind of deal a similar way with dealing with vehicles and Dungeons and Dragons. But what I really love about the spaceship is that it's very customizable, and you can really build it to really fit your tone of the game and also the characters that you're going to have. And it really also helps that there's just this variety of spaceships you can choose from, which gives it a very Firefly feel from the Firefly RPG, where you have all these different spaceships you can choose from. Space SNS actually does a really great job of giving you a plethora of spaceships to choose from that can range in strengths, weaknesses, and so forth. But while the adaptive changes of the game are great and needed, the area that truly shines in this game is the mythos and world building that is constructed around it. The creators of SNS have a clear concept and a vast imagination in mind when they constructed this world, complete with what feels like a thriving set of planets, governments, people, and races that give the world an identifiable yet unique feel to it. And I have to admit that not since Mass Effect have I seen such just an ingeniously built world dynamic for science fiction. Usually, a lot of people for science fiction tend to cut corners. They tend to go with very noticeable elements from like Star Wars, Star Trek, and this one does it too, but it's very original, very unique, and very imaginative. The creators do a great job at building the world while keeping it just vague enough that you can insert your own story into the mix. It gives you the races, the planet, and the politics without over-hampering you with this cumbersome story that pretty well pushes players into playing the sort of story that the creator always envisioned. And don't get me wrong, there's obviously some inspiration thrown in there. The Hanadarians are obviously based on elves by their look and their model, and then the Ezonites are also look very much like Genasi, and kind of function like them too. So there is definitely some grounding elements, but it's also very different from what I can imagine to be the source material, to the point where it feels like its own different entity. And then I also really love the fact that when it comes to the races, you have races like the Ick, and also the Sagar... I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this, please forgive me. The Saguaran, which is like this cactus race. And the Ick is this insect race, and I find it just very fascinating that you would add these sort of characters into the mix, because usually in science fiction these creatures, these races might be in the game, but they tend not to be playable, or the creators don't think people want to play them. I see this a lot whenever I saw like homebrew Mass Effect games that completely skip creating Hanar characters, creating Eldcor characters, or Volus characters, whenever some people might actually want to play those races. So I love the fact that this game instantly says, everything's on the table, you can play whatever you want. And I think that that is also just an amazing addition to the game. I think the biggest con of this game is something that is even less of a con and is more of something that can be fixed moving down the road, and that is, it kind of still leaves me wanting more than what was in the book. Now, I understand that this is also an independent project, and usually you don't want your independent RPGs to run 600 to 800 or whatever pages, especially if you're just kind of thinking, I want to try something that's off the beaten path. You look and see this thing's 600 pages, and usually it has people running for the hills. So I can understand completely that you want to downsize, you want to cut back. But a lot of this book is actually giving the information about 5th edition mechanics into the book, which usually a lot of the open source books would just say, go look at the player's handbook for Dungeons & Dragons. If you want the mechanics for this, we're going to focus on mythos, world building, and so forth. And I think that this game could have probably taken that route to add a little bit more to what they're basically giving us. It is still a plus, though, that you can pick up this game without owning a 5th edition handbook and play it. However, a little more information, such as maps, a slight history, just ever so slight history, an expansion on the monsters and enemies in the back of the book, which is a little sparse, and an expansion on the universe could have added a bit more to the overall immersive experience of a storyteller and the players really getting into this new setting. Again, if your biggest flaw is that you left the audience wanting more, that's a pretty good place to be in, especially whenever you can add things later on, such as a bestiary, such as map packs, concept art, and so forth. So with that being said, this game gets a crit. It is a fantastic game, and it is one of the science fiction games that I've looked at and seen that it doesn't really piggyback off of these already pre-conceptualized science fiction movies and television shows. It definitely takes some inspiration and says as much in the book, but it really does give an original and creative experience that I rarely see in the science fiction genre of RPGs. And I will go out and say this, that if you're a fan of 5th edition, and if you are like a huge fan of science fiction and space epics, I would say pick this game up instead of, Paizo's Starfinder. I think SNS is actually a better game than Paizo's Starfinder, and I heavily suggest people go to DriveThruRPG and get this book very soon. Thank you all so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. Become my patron on Patreon. And also, please come back soon for a new video. Thank you all so much.